Well, I think we're ready to begin, and a very warm welcome to everybody to this webinar on power, personality, and popularism, organized by the Maudsley Philosophy Group. So my name is Gareth Owen, and I'll chair today's presentations and discussions. I'm a trustee and founding member of the Maudsley Philosophy Group and a reader and honorary consultant psychiatrist at King's College London. So for those who don't know the Maudsley Philosophy Group, we're a charity affiliated with the Maudsley Hospital and the Institute of Psychiatry, which is one of Europe's largest teaching hospitals in psychiatry and psychiatric research. The group's been active for more than 15 years, promoting dialogue between psychiatry and philosophy. More recently, the group's become interested in power and personality, continuing work of a charity called the Daedalus Trust on the effects of power on the personality of those in high office. So our topic today grew out of concern about the new popularism in politics and the revolutionary new social media within which it operates. This ecosystem is often characterized as tribal or polarized. In today's webinar, we want to widen the lens on power and personality to think about how personality types may rise to power within this new ecosystem. The great philosopher and psychiatrist Karl Jaspers, who's been a real inspiration for the Maudsley Philosophy Group, he lived through populist movements in the 1920s and 1930s in Germany. And he wrote, quotes, "During times of revolution, large numbers of abnormal personalities gain a transient significance. It's true that they have neither made the revolution nor contributed constructively to it, but such a situation affords them a momentary opportunity to manifest themselves. In peaceful times, says Kretschmer, we assess them in the courts with a medical report. In turbulent times, they become our rulers." So I think Jaspers gives us an interesting stimulus and starting point for our day. The issues around power, personality, and popularism are not new, but need to be rethought, relearnt in our times. It's also clear that they require a multi-perspective approach. So to address our topic today, we've got some leading thinkers from diverse backgrounds. So they will be offering perspectives from the media, from psychiatry, and from history. We're going to have 30-minute presentations and 15-minute Q&As. So please put your questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. Yeah. And I'll try to bring in as many as possible for the speakers. So there'll be 2 breaks, and we'll build to our plenary session where the 3 perspectives from media, psychiatry, and history will come together in dialogue, again, with a chance for you to put questions. So we'll aim to keep to time. It's 1:30 thereabouts in the UK and 8:30 on the East Coast of the US, where several of our speakers, or some of our speakers and audience members are joining from. So we'll be finished by late tea time in the UK and by lunchtime in the US. We'll begin with perspectives from media, with talks from Peter Pomerantsev and then Gillian Tett. We're expecting Gillian, but she needs to escape to write about Joe Biden's visit to London. So we'll speak only, but Peter will take questions after both have spoken and is going to be here for the whole webinar. So this is a small adjustment to the original schedule, and the new schedule can be seen in the chat. To get us started, I'm delighted to introduce Peter Pomerantsev. Peter is a senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University, where he co-directs the ARENA initiative, which is a research project dedicated to overcoming the challenges of digital era disinformation and polarization. He's also a TV producer and a writer, most recently authoring a book, This Is Not Propaganda, which was a Times Book of the Year. So Peter, very warm welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Just to tell you a bit more about myself, you're quite right. I thought you're quite right to identify that I'm now sort of vaguely connected with universities, which might mean that I'm sort of dimly respectable, but I should really, underline that when I left university, I did the most, skizziest, dodgy, and possibly amoral job that you could ever do. I worked in television and I worked in entertainment television. I made reality shows, first in Britain and then in Russia. That was actually the subject of my first book, this Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. And then my second book was already me crawling towards respectability, trying to work out how we fix the mess that I suppose I, and certainly the industry that I worked in, helped to make. And I wanted to start off with that in my ramble this morning around these topics of personality and media, and from the very kind of amateur place where I am. So, I'm often asked, and we often get into discussions about, what's to blame for this, for this eruption of a bunch of political figures that we all very, very casually and to the kind of like, to the great chagrin of many political scientists call populists. But let's name them instead of just sort of labeling them. I mean, Salvini in Italy, who we've studied a lot at my little research initiative, or Donald Trump, of course, or in many ways, Vladimir Putin, but certainly Bolsonaro, Orban, and Modi, and of course, for me, really the creme de la creme, Duterte in the Philippines. Where have they emerged from? And you often get into this discussion about whether it's about, social media and something in the nature of social media as somehow connected with technology. That technology has driven this, and in the much overused phrase of Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. And then you get other people going, what nonsense. No, this has got to do with culture, with politics, with the failure of neoliberalism. That's the thing that's usually blamed. It's the failure of neoliberalism. That's caused it all. I'm going to come at this from a position which I think unites these various things, but really very much from my television background. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into some markers of these characters and what I think that might say about the world we live in. So look, my first job after university, I actually went to film school as well. So I was dreaming of becoming an auteur filmmaker. And like everyone who dreams of becoming an auteur filmmaker, I end up making TV, which in the early 2000s means factual entertainment and reality shows. And the gossip that you'd hear from TV producers who'd been there in the glorious first days of Big Brother and The Apprentice, which is of course a show that's played a big role in our political lives, was about the evolution of these genres. And basically this is the story that they tell us as we were sort of sitting there carrying around coffees from edit suite to edit suite. They said, look, when the reality show started, it wasn't like it is today. The first reality shows were really honest attempts to understand society, putting cameras in a house to understand the complex social class dynamics playing out there. Or the first season of The Apprentice was a sort of, a genuine attempt to understand the values and dynamics of how you do business. And the first shows came out and they were a bit dull. They were a bit dull. And so the TV producers were like, oh, we can't have this. And so they started to engineer a different type of reality. Or I should stop saying about they, I'm part of this demonic industry. We started to engineer situations of conflict where there was none. We started to introduce toxic characters whose single raison d'etre was to cause scandal for the sake of it. I think if we really talk about the genealogy of Duterte and Donald Trump and Bolsonaro, we really should be looking at season 2 of Big Brother and the introduction of Nasty Nick. Nasty Nick, some of you may remember, so others may say they don't remember, but really watch this, was a character in Big Brother that made Big Brother huge. He was a nasty, unpleasant, toxic individual who was completely addictive viewing. And suddenly we found that reality fashioned around scandalization, conflict for the sake of conflict, and these purposefully self-scandalizing characters was rather good. It was making the shows very popular. Now, I think it's very interesting seeing the rise of the reality show in a political and cultural context. It's the 1990s, the end of history, any kind of serious debates have gone out of politics, and politics itself is becoming more and more about personality and a bit of a reality show. You've got Bill Clinton and our own little Bill Clinton, Tony Blair. And, these are already people who are sort of fixated with their image, where all of the meaning is kind of not really up for debate. In that sense, everybody has, I suppose, agreed to the idea that the future is one great big, happy, dare I say, neoliberal global village. And I don't think it's an accident that you have this rise of the reality show as our major cultural signifier and product and defining genre, just as you have this generation of politicians who are about nothing but reality show, but usually in a kind of friendly way. Clinton and Blair are kind of the positive characters that we'd cast on a reality show. So you already have this kind of political space where there's no kind of deep meaning and there's just play. You have this genre that's starting to dominate our popular culture, which is all about sort of surface level interaction with no particular attempt at deeper meaning. And at the same time, as this sort of increase and augments throughout the 2000s, by this time I'm in Russia, where, Putin's spin doctors are openly talking about how they want to make a reality show out of Putin. They visit reality show sets going, okay, how do we recreate politics with no meaning, but which has kind of fun built in? While I'm in Russia in the early 2000s, they sort of, define a whole system called managed democracy, where you have different political parties, but the political parties are all controlled by the Kremlin. They're all told what to do by the Kremlin, but they had to kind of imitate conflict. You even have these kind of pseudo debates on TV where people imitate, the left and the right. Everyone knows it's a complete game. It's a complete buffoonery. Putin is the sort of mystical figure above these sordid games, but they're thinking very much about how they make the sort of pseudo democracy completely hollowed out democracy, but with this kind of reality show surface. Now, while this is happening, and the reality show starts to permeate everything, and politics sort of follows it or accompanies it, you have a bunch of geniuses sitting around at Harvard and Silicon Valley, starting to design what we would think of later as social media. And as they do that, and here I have a completely unproven supposition that is based purely on my sense of instinct, so deeply unscientific, but as they look around, all that they really know by now is the reality show. That's what they've grown up with. That's what Zuckerberg's grown up with. That's what the even stranger guy, Jack Dorsey, who created Twitter, grew up with. That's their norm. That's their idea of social behavior. And they start to define and design social media just the way a TV producer would create a reality show. They create a system that rewards self-scandalization. They create a system that rewards and makes money off the simplest kind of polarization and conflict. If I was a TV producer and wanted to define sort of a social media space, I would design it like Twitter and Facebook. So the whole design concept is already infused with all these various cultural and political values. And that in turn then accelerates the rise of a cohort of politicians who play essentially along the rules of Nasty Nick in season 2 of Big Brother. I mean, most obviously Donald Trump, who's literally come from reality show world and made the very smooth transition into social media land because it's designed by exactly the same rules that he understands. Now, let me take one of these characters and show how, we're now at this point really where the social media system almost summons up a certain behavior from a certain type of politician. So in between 17 and 19, we worked with Corriere della Sera, which is the newspaper of record in Italy, to look at how they can cover the topic of migration in a way that would cause a civic discussion on this very, very polarizing topic. We started monitoring, how the Italian media was trying to cover this issue. So there's a very interesting thing happening in Italy between 2017, 2019. The numbers of migrants are falling rapidly, massively. 80% one year, 200% the next year. Basically, a deal was done to stop, if you remember, the huge inflow of refugees across the Mediterranean. However, even as the amount of migrants is going down, the amount of stories Corriere are doing is doubling and sometimes tripling. So something weird is going on. The story is becoming less of a story. The way it's being covered is going up. And of course, the engine of this is Matteo Salvini, the kind of very, very social media driven right-wing Italian politician. And what he's doing, first as a candidate and then as a junior partner in the government as the Minister for Home Affairs, is creating pseudo conflicts, creating situations of polarizing and scandalous events which drive the discussion. For example, a ship full of migrants is coming across the Mediterranean. Salvini, though it is not within his power, blocks it, stops it from docking. A court goes, hold on, this is illegal. You can't stop a ship from docking. A huge scandal arises out of nothing. A huge scandal arises. Salvini, in his Facebook blog, which is more popular than all the Italian newspapers, starts saying how he's now at war with the establishment, all the establishment want to destroy the fabric of Italy. He creates this situation. Just reporting, and he'd created on social media. Corriere della Sera have to cover it, and their most popular articles are the ones that cover Salvini's Facebook blog. We talked a lot with Corriere. What could we do? Could we cover other aspects? Could we do background pieces? Could we do all these other ways of covering this issue that didn't fall into the agendas and framings that Salvini wanted? And they were like, we could, we can, we tried. But there's a problem here. Because the whole economy of social media is based on likes and shares, which is in turn rewards the most scandalizing, the most self-scandalizing, the most polarizing content, because it was designed in a way to reward the behavior of a nasty Nick or a nasty Matteo, they're just stuck. They're just stuck in this loop where they have to follow the agenda and the framing Salvini sets. They have to follow the scandalous model that he's pushing forward if they want to survive as a business, because they're dependent on an ad revenue coming from likes and shares. So we're in a loop now. We're in a loop where a certain type of media is, which was, I think, created really in a certain political environment, is in turn creating a certain type of politician who then in turn strengthens the media model. But I think we have to go a little bit closer as well, because there's a few other things going on here, which again will take us back to the 1990s in terms of understanding these characters more. I do think the technological part is very important. I hope we talk about it a lot today. So let's zoom in a little bit on these characters. What do they have in common? We often bundle them together. Salvini, Orban, Duterte, Bolsonaro, Trump. Sometimes Johnson is put in there, but definitely Farage. What do they really have in common? Is it ideology? They tend towards being nationalist, for sure. But if you take someone like Duterte in the Philippines, because he's fighting a Catholic establishment, he's on the side of gay rights. He's on the side of left-wing organizations. So simply calling them right-wing, I don't think necessarily works. I think the one thing that really strikes me about them that they have in common is their language. And it's a language that, again, I recognize very much from my time as a TV producer, which is obsessed with sexual obscenities. Scatological language, whether it's Trump talking about, Megyn Kelly's private parts during an interview, or it's Putin, who really revolutionized Russian political language by being the first to talk about people's private parts in sort of national conferences. It was a shocking moment that really branded his style on Russian TV. Whether it's Bolsonaro or Duterte in the Philippines, who's really, who makes Trump look like a Puritan in his deeply misogynistic and very, very colorful, shall we say, use of sexual language. And it reminded me a lot, obviously that language was, a big part of reality show and, shocking people. But it reminded me of something else as well. It reminded me of one of my favorite Soviet literary theorists, Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin, for those who don't know him, was a very important sort of Russian literary theorist, gets basically sent into exile and lives in a little hut, I think, in either the Ural or Siberia during Stalin years. And he has this very famous book about Rabelais, about the Carnivalesque. And he says one of the main features of the Carnivalesque is this use of scatological language. This is the rebellion of the physical lower parts against the higher parts, which is a mirror of the rebellion of the lower classes against the higher classes. And in Carnival, that's done in a very controlled way. You have a few days where the beggar is made the king, where the prostitute is made a nun, and everything is turned upside down. And the use of obscenity is a huge part of that. And Bakhtin saw something in that was very liberating. He thought that was very important, that society should be constantly re-examining itself and turning itself over, but for order to then be restored. The reality show, again, in many ways, is our modern carnival. Yeah, it's the moment where a poor person can become rich in this magical scenario where obscenities and sexual licentiousness is rewarded. I mean, in that sense, Donald Trump is literally a character from the American carnival. But there's a difference between, our carnival characters, the Bolsonaros, the Trumps, the Salvinis, and the ones that Bakhtin is describing. Because our ones aren't actually poor and helpless people made kings for a day. They're actually very powerful people masquerading as poor, helpless people, masquerading as powerful people. It's a double disguise. And that's where the carnival becomes very dangerous, because they have no intention of staying for one day. And they've hacked into the carnival. They have no intention of staying for just one day. And there's a danger in the carnival in the sense that the way it suspends all rules, the way it suspends all norms, creates a space of danger. It's not accidental that we often have horror movies that start at a fairground attraction, or that murder scenes happen during carnivals in James Bond movies, for example. And I don't know, in J.G. Fraser, the Golden Bough, he alleges that in the 19th century, you'd still find dead bodies on Carlton Hill in Edinburgh after Beltane, which is the big kind of carnival, pagan carnival in Scotland. So these guys have hacked into the carnival. They have no intention of leaving, but they've created this space around them, which is preceded by their language of no morality and no rules and no norms. So the linguistic code breaking is the anticipation of the moral and legal code breaking. So I think that's very important, tying together their language. And of course, the internet, and especially the bit of the internet that we associate with the alt-right, celebrates itself as a carnival. We have the head of the Daily Stormer, which is a neo-Nazi website, openly saying, we're going to weaponize the anarchic humor of the internet in order to legitimize, in his case, just outright Nazi aims. But the whole tone of the internet, especially, I don't know, the Gabs, the 4chans, the 8chans of this world, is deeply, deeply sardonic, deeply satirical. Its aim is to provoke people by being the bête noirs of society. Very, very sort of aggressively celebrates and sees itself as a carnivalesque process. So that's the language. We've got 12 minutes left, or I've got 7 minutes left to cover the death of truth and nostalgia. It should be easy. So if language is something that connects these guys, the other one, and this is the one that people spend the most time thinking about, is their seeming lack of care about the truth. Post-truth was a word that became the bête noire of political scientists almost as much as the word populist. But what do we mean by that? I think we have to really nail down what we mean. When Putin goes on international television and says there are no Russian soldiers in Crimea when everybody knows there are, he's not lying. He's not lying the way Gorbachev or Brezhnev would lie about various types of Soviet secret operations. He's not disguising the truth. He's saying he doesn't care about the truth. Now, that could just be a sign of bullying and self-confidence. I'm so big and powerful, I don't care about the truth. But that misses a very important point. If you just see it as intimidation, that misses the amount of pleasure that people derive from it. There is some sort of pleasure of giving a big middle finger to facts. There is a pleasure in the way Donald Trump would rebel from reality. There is a pleasure that is generated, and we have to think about what that pleasure is. I think Eli will go much, much deeper than I do about the various pleasures that these guys carry. But just on this one, because it's critical for my work, we do research to then advise media, public diplomacy, civil society about how you communicate in this environment. How do you communicate in an environment where people don't want to listen to the facts? They don't care about them. Because facts are generally unpleasant. Yeah, they remind you that you're going to get old. They remind you that you're going to die. It's a surprise they ever played much of a role. Why wouldn't you always want the politician who tells facts to fuck off? It's very interesting to compare to the Cold War and to now. In the Cold War, you had lots and lots and lots of lies coming from politicians, but they made this effort to make them sound real. The Soviets even had all these institutes that were trying to pretend or do this sort of mind melding maths with the Soviet economy to prove that somehow it was doing well. So what's changed? And here I think we do go back to the 1990s. I think when we're talking about the Cold War, we're talking about politicians who are still living within the paradigm of some sort of future-orientated idea. Communism is meant to bring you a glorious future. You need facts to prove that you're going to get there. Evidence is part of these Enlightenment doctrines that has a future that people are meant to arrive at. Democratic capitalism, less of an ideology, but still grounded in some sort of Enlightenment idea of progress. You're still meant to prove you're getting somewhere. That idea of the future is deeply allied in political language to evidence and facts. And then what happens? What happens in between the Cold War and now? So my last book, I interviewed a lot of spin doctors around Putin, among many other spin doctors, trying to work out, how they cooked up the Putin model in the 90s and 2000s. And the way they explained it was, look, we lived in a world where all the ideologies were dead. Communism, no one believed in the 1990s in Russia anymore. Capitalism stops being a pleasant idea after 1993. And in this environment, facts stop mattering. We're not trying to prove people we're getting anywhere anymore. It was very interesting. I talked to a couple of historians, said we also talked about the end of history, like Fukuyama did, but we thought it was tragic. Because the minute history goes, the minute we don't have any direction within which to put political speech, we have no need for evidence anymore. There's no idea of progress that we're even trying to imitate anymore. And if all the facts do is tell you that your economy is collapsing and there's no way around that, and that the death rate is increasing, they're not very pleasant. You have this emergence of a generation of politicians in the 1990s in Russia who were pre-Trumpian in the way they anticipate this sort of rebellion against the language of evidence. Vladimir Zhirinovsky's speeches from the 1990s are almost line by line, and most importantly, tone by tone, preempt Trump, including the reaction of the audience, which Pavlikovsky was a great film director, sort of films, and it's this incredible mix that people have of, is he joking? Can he really be saying that? Who cares? It's fun. And the Russian spin doctors I talked to said, look, you guys are now going through in the West what we went through in the 1990s. Yeah, since the crisis of 2008, since the realization for many people that, you know, the future isn't going to be nicer for their kids than for them, you're going through a soft version of what we went through. And the appeal of politicians who give two big fingers up to the truth is now starting to pervade your space. Slower, softer, not as abrupt as what happened in Russia in the 1990s, but still very much part of this moment. So I'm going to tie everything together with one last idea. I mean, what really these guys all have in common is that they have no idea of the future. They're all, in various ways, nostalgists. The future doesn't exist in their rhetoric. And there's two ways, I think, that we can deal with the past and nostalgia in an environment where there is no clear future anymore. Summarized very beautifully by Svetlana Boym, who was a Russian emigre philologist at Harvard, who died quite recently, sadly. And she talks about two types of nostalgia. One that takes society over in unreal but aggressive fantasies of the past that never existed. And in trying to recreate it, excludes everyone. And the other one is what she called sort of reflective nostalgia, which is looking at the past in a way that allows you to distance yourself from it, ironically. I'll end on that note. I think my time is 1 minute up. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Peter. That was a fantastic start to the webinar. We can't. I don't think we can clap on a webinar, but anyway, I'm sure there's applause out there. So you're gonna stay, and there's going to be a Q&A session after we've heard from Gillian Tett. So welcome, Gillian. Gillian's going to. Well, I was saying earlier, Gillian, that you've got to go off and deal with all sorts of things, including Joe Biden. So you're not going to be able to stay for the webinar. You're going to talk and then have to leave. But we're hugely honoured to have Gillian with us. She's a well-known Financial Times journalist and chair of the editorial board at the Financial Times. She holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Cambridge, and her new book, which is called Anthrovision, A New Way to See in Business and Life, has just been published, and makes the case for anthropological intelligence in high-powered business and political settings. And this is a particular kind of interest of hers. So over to you, Gillian.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'm so sorry to be talking late today, joining you late and having to leave early. As you just heard, in fact, my book has just been published. The reason I'm sitting here sort of, in slightly TV makeup is because I'm in the middle of doing a whole bunch of TV hits in America on talk shows to talk about it. So I'm really sorry to be dipping in and out, but I'm delighted to be taking part in this event today, because the book doesn't just make an appeal for anthropology, it makes an appeal for social science more broadly. Many of the boundaries that we have today in the academic world are pretty artificial. And essentially what I'm calling for is a focus on culture, for people to think about cultural patterns and how they, the way that we operate, not just in terms of individual brains, but group dynamics, and also how they intersect in terms of how different types of cultures intersect with each other. And I should stress that culture doesn't exist in boxes, it's a spectrum, but it is a spectrum of difference that we need to be alive and alert to. Now, I'm going to share one idea with you from my book, which I think is quite relevant to what Peter's just been talking about, which I thought was fascinating, the last half that I caught, which is really the issue of individualism and customization above all else. Because I think one thing we need to think about in terms of politics and information flows is the degree to which we live in what I like to call Generation C, generation customization. What do I mean by that? Well, my ideas are shaped by someone called Joseph Henrich, who may be known to some of you as an anthropologist, an evolutionary anthropologist, a man who's had an amazing Renaissance-style career because he was originally an engineer and working in hard sciences, and then went across to anthropology and has worked to both look particularly at physical anthropology, look at issues of psychology, but also culture as well. And he makes a point which is very punchy and powerful, which is that today Western society is shaped by what he calls the weird complex: Western, educated, individualistic, rich, and democratic. And because it's a trait of every culture in the world to assume that the way that you operate is normal, inevitable, and everyone else is strange, people who have grown up in this weird environment assume that that is the way to work, the main way to work. In fact, if you look at the sweep of history, the vast majority of societies anywhere in the world at any point in time are not weird in that idea of being educated, individualistic, rich, and democratic. They have a very different set of dynamics on, let me stress, a spectrum of difference. Now, I became very interested in this issue about weird versus non-weird cultures, partly because of how they present the idea of the individual. As someone who's actually worked in other non-Western cultures, I'm keenly aware that the way that weird cultures we see the individual is different from many other societies. Broadly speaking, in many cultures in the world, the individual is seen as the derivative of a society, and your identity is pushed onto you, or rather you inherit your identity, and you're not presumed to have a lot of room to renegotiate that. Whereas in the 20th century, we very much developed the idea in Western cultures that individuals were at the center of the world. Society was a derivative of the individual, as Margaret Thatcher said. And that essentially we presumed the individual revolved around, the world revolved around us as individuals, and we could define and negotiate our own identities. This was the rise of the me generation, if you like. But I think in the 21st century, something very interesting has happened, which in some ways is an extrapolation of this, which is that we don't just have the idea of the individual being the center of the world, society being a derivative of the individual, as opposed to the individual being a derivative of society, is a kind of Copernican revolution, if you like. We also have this idea, courtesy of digital technology, that we can fashion the world and customize the world as we want. And this idea has sort of slipped in through generations in a very subtle way, but it's become very pervasive. And I have to admit, I first noticed it when I took my daughters along to Starbucks when they were smaller. And as someone who's reared in sort of 1970s, 1980s Britain, you know, I kind of felt grateful if you had two choices, coffee or tea. My daughters would sit there and want to customize their coffee to the nth degree because they presumed they could. That was kind of almost seen as an entitlement. And it's not surprising because this idea of personalization, customization has seeped into almost every area of consumer culture. If you look at choices, say, in music, 100 years ago, if you wanted to listen to music, you had to go and do it in person according to somebody else's schedule. Then, of course, we had the rise of radio, which you could do on the move, or you can go out and buy a vinyl record that you could play whenever you wanted, but that record was still a selection of music assembled on someone else's whim or someone else's choices. You had, if you like, a fixed menu there to choose. If you went to restaurants, you basically tended to have a bit of choice, but not a lot. If you went to clothing stores, ditto. But today you have a generation that wants to have a playlist for their music choices, to download whatever they want, when they want, from wherever they want, at a whim, in a customized way. And that pattern, that playlist pattern, that pick and mix pattern, if you like, is extended into so many areas of consumer culture, including, and this is where I come in really to the main theme of today, politics. Because I think another very interesting development today is that we're seeing increasingly the rise of a pick and mix political culture. The idea that was around the 20th century that you just had preset menu options called political parties, where you were either conservative or Labour or, for a while, Liberal Democrat, whatever that stood for, that kind of menu, I would argue, is increasingly out of fashion. Because increasingly you're seeing younger people say that they want to rally around single issues, single personalities, tapping into what Peter's been talking about, single brands. It's a rise, if you like, of branded politics, where there's an incredibly fickle consumption pattern. People gravitate around one shiny issue for a while. You can have these cyber flash mobs, if you like, around single issues. Suddenly a lot of heat and light flares up, but you can't necessarily assume that it is going to be a long-term love affair. And you can't necessarily extrapolate from that people are going to accept an entire political menu, an entire political party as a result of that. Because that leads me to something else, which is the issue of trust and the question of where people get their advice, inspiration, ideas from, and what kind of information networks and what kind of patterns of trust are involved in that. Now, when I was an anthropologist at Cambridge several decades ago, along with people like Quinton, I was basically told that trust can exist on two axes. You can have vertical trust and you can have horizontal trust. Horizontal trust is a kind of face-to-face, peer-to-peer trust patterns you get in small groups, where a group decides to work together and to get their information from each other, essentially because they know each other and they can eyeball each other, and you have horizontal trust. Then as groups get bigger, you have vertical trust, because people no longer can eyeball each other, so they get their source of trust that glues the social groups together, essentially through hierarchical vertical relationships. They trust in an institution, in a leader, in something like that. The 21st century, though, has delivered a very interesting new form of trust, which is essentially horizontal trust on a massive scale, courtesy of digital networks, what some anthropologists and sociologists call distributed trust patterns, where essentially people are getting their trust on the basis of wide group relationships mediated with digital ties. And that is building not just a pattern of trust, some sense of cohesion, but also at the core of a lot of information flows and ideas about where people get their advice for life from. You can see one version of distributed trust in, say, Uber. How do you trust whether or not to get in a car? It's because you basically have the wisdom of the crowd voting via digital networks on whether something is safe or not. You can see that with Airbnb. You can see another form of distributed trust with Bitcoin. But you can also see that when you come to the way that groups are acting in politics and the way that this kind of pick and mix culture in consumers is developing. Because essentially what you're seeing is increasingly networks of people sharing information that's customized. You choose to be part of this network. You choose in that weird culture to essentially define your own identity through membership of a group, and essentially to identify what news sources, what source of advice you want to have, who you're going to trust. You choose that yourself. And that group then essentially acts as a way of disseminating ideas in a way that, if you like, is more democratic, more based on horizontal trust than what we saw in many other earlier eras. In some ways, that's fantastically good. In some ways, it's more democratic. It creates more empowerment. It creates more immediacy. There's a lot of benefit to this. But in other ways, as Peter has discussed, and I'm sure is going to be picked up on later on today, it's also dangerous because self-selecting groups, identities that you yourself can customize and fashion at all times, can also create cyber tribalism, to use a word that isn't a technical term. Anthropologists hate using the word tribalism because they tend to prefer it in a more specific academic setting. But as a way of capturing this idea of echo chambers, ghettos, all kinds of problems that are proliferating today, and explaining why we have a culture which is so polarized. And what makes it doubly dangerous is that the media model we have today is essentially incentivizing people, journalists, consumers to reinforce that polarization, either because the providers of news need to have a sticky, passionate audience which they can keep engaged. And one way to do that is by really pandering into that tribalist pattern, or because people increasingly feel that they are time short, it's a crowded landscape, it's very noisy, you have to stand up and shout if you want attention. And the best way to do that is to embrace the extremes. So those are just a few sort of cultural thoughts about how to frame this wider debate. As I said, I really appreciate what Peter said. I really appreciate what this conference is trying to do. And I really hope it can be start of a new interdisciplinary dialogue and debate with journalists, with political actors, about how to make sense of where this very weird world, and I use the word weird in both the sense that Hendrik uses is and the popular sense, how this weird world works and where it's going, and why we might possibly put it on a slightly less damaging path. So thank you.
Well, thanks, Gillian, and for being able to join us on what sounds like really big for you. So, I don't know. Do you have to shift off now, or can you stay with us for a little bit for questions?
Yeah, I've got 15 minutes or so I'm very happy to.
Okay. Well, maybe you can just
take most of the questions. I thought his talk was much brainier than mine. So.
Okay. Well, maybe just if you can just stay, until you can, and we'll just start taking some questions. Perhaps people can just specify whether they want to ask Gillian or ask Peter or both. So we've got one question incoming now from Niall Boyce. Do you think that social media has brought about a change in the concept of the self, less based around individual inwardness and more around external signifiers as self as brand? So who'd like to pick up on that one? Peter, do you want to go first?
Listen, it's a puzzle actually, which I'm thinking about myself. I think Eli's hand went up though, so Eli, go for it. You're muted.
Eli, you're muted.
Can I jump in while he's saying that and say what I find fascinating is that social media is both a microphone and a mirror. And it enables an individual both to broadcast their views and to have this sense of empowerment, and frankly, to have this sense of entitlement that they have a voice. If you go back 20, 30, 50 years ago, people didn't feel entitled to have a voice if they were low down in the hierarchy of power. Now they do. And that has potentially revolutionary implications. Think about the hashtag #MeToo movement and how people who had previously been voiceless suddenly coalesced. They'd been fragmented. They suddenly were unified and actually exercised power. But what's fascinating, and by the way, I should say that for the younger generation, using the voice in this way is increasingly replacing the ballot box as what they define as political. That's exasperating for many mainstream politicians, but it's striking. The flip side, though, is that social media is not just a megaphone and a microphone, it's also a mirror. And it's enabling people to look back at themselves constantly in a way that's created all kinds of psychological stresses that we know about, but is also actually reinforcing this tendency to use this pick and mix culture to define or shape their own identities. And, you know, that's, again, creating all kinds of psychological issues, I would imagine. You're the psychologist experts. It also, though, tends to reinforce this sense of tribalism and group dynamics, because people feel like, you know, on the one hand, they're individualistic. They can choose what signals and symbols they want to emote, but at the same time, to actually be part of a group identity, you need to embrace group symbols. And the last one I'll point to is that this has really interesting implications for how we think about big data analysis and political persuasion, to use the terms of Cambridge Analytica. I have a chapter in my book about Cambridge Analytica, which is a group I knew very well for many, many years, way before the scandals erupted. And one of the passages in my book describes the fight that took place between Nigel Oakes and Alexander Nix about Facebook likes. And as you know, as it became infamous later on, Nix and co. assumed that they had these amazing models which showed that if you had Facebook likes in a certain pattern, people were likely to vote a certain way. So if I like this hat online, that's a really good signal about my cultural proclivities as an individual. Nigel Oakes, who was in fact the original progenitor of Cambridge Analytica, said, to quote him, "total bollocks." And the reason he said total bollocks was because if someone says, I like something on a Facebook post, it's not just me liking the hat. It's usually me liking that relationship. I'm usually trying to signal support for a social relationship. And that has a very different pattern. And that indicates that actually, even though we think we are totally individualistic online, we are still shaped by social dynamics in potentially a very powerful way. I'll shut up there because I'm sure Eli's got his microphone working now.
Well, I tell you what, because we're about to lose you, Gillian, there's another question that's come directly to you, because I think this question about the self, I'm sure we'll be returning to, and I'm sure that's going to be something for the plenary. But there's one for you, Gillian, which is do you think, is there a way, this is from Mona Deeley, is there a way to row back from the extremes that are now a necessary part of gaining and exercising power? So your thoughts on that before you...
Yeah, sure. I have got a few more minutes, so I will carry on listening. So I want to hear what the others are saying. I hope this is being recorded so I can watch it later. In fact, I can see it is. How do we roll back from the extremes of self, you know, if you like, you know, obsession with self, and extreme, as extension, that tribalism?
Oui. I think Gillian is frozen.
Oh dear.
Well, she's going to be able to stay a little bit longer. So, Peter or Eli, do you want to pick up on this question about that we were discussing earlier about the self?
What is the question about the self?
So, do you think that social media has brought about a change in the concept of self? Did you hear the question?
Yes, I heard the question. I'm not sure how to answer it. I mean, the concept of the self, whatever that means, is always changing. So of course it has changed. Of course it's brought about some change. It's a way to express the self that didn't exist earlier. So, you know, but no, I want to wait for Gillian to come back, because I had a question about her idea about trust and horizontal trust, but I'd rather pose it to her if she's returning.
Okay, well, we'll leave that for a bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to ask a question. Actually, I go to questions and answers and I see them, but I don't know how to.
Well, this is.
Oh, you raise your hand there. Is this what you do? Oh no, that's
no. This is what we're going to be doing is using this mainly as questions and answers for the speakers. So this is really for Peter. But if you've got a kind of burning point, Eli, then you can come in. You just enter.
It's not a burning point, but just in general, how do I ask a question?
So through the Q&A function of the Zoom.
Yeah, but I've got And then
So if you just put if you write this is for everybody really, if you write your question in the Q&A function at the bottom,
okay.
Then then there's a way in which it can come through to me.
I see.
Okay. So if you mute for now,
yeah,
we'll take a few more questions. So Peter, you ready?
Yeah, I can do a bit on the self. I was thinking about Gillian's back. What Gillian was saying. I think there's two things that strike me. One, when we go back to, and in my last book, This is Not Propaganda, I'm jumping all the time between the Cold War and my parents' experience in the Cold War and today, which is why I use it as a touch point all the time. But there was this idea that the free self was one that was very self-expressive, as Gillian said, that both in terms of having the right to speak. In a democracy, you had the right to say things. In dictatorship, you didn't. But also in terms of, certain types of jazz and modern art and personality. Even there's an idea of the free self, however you define it. I think it's very interesting. Now I think that's been turned upside down. Obviously, in censorious places and with minorities who haven't had the chance to speak before, without a doubt, social media is empowering. But I think very quickly we're shifting to the sense that actually the technology leans towards totalitarianism, that the more you express yourself on it, the less power you have. The more you express yourself on it, the more your self-expression is an illusion, which is actually just turned into data, which is given to advertisers in a good place, Cambridge Analytica and in a dodgy democracy, or to the Chinese Communist Party. So I think we're seeing a reversal. I think we're seeing a rupturing of the immediate association between emancipation and self-expression, and now freedom is not being online. The very rich are not online. If you have real power, you don't say anything. It's a sign of poverty and lack of power that you have to use Facebook. So something's shifting. And with that, I think you see art changing. So now doing a kind of self-indulgent, expressionistic, me kind of literature, which would be seen as rebellious and avant-garde in the, in communist Russia or Nazi Germany, would now be seen as the worst kind of, capitalistic slavery and, the equivalent of Gillian's kids obsessing over their Starbucks. Modernism now would probably deface the self. So I think that's shifted. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the self-branding thing and our relationships with phones. I think we're only just starting to understand how deep that is. And a lot of people talk about Erving Goffman, how our social media selves are this theater we put up. I'm seeing something else. I have teenage kids. I wish it was that. I wish they were just projecting an ideal there. Something much scarier is going on. Teenagers are filming everything they do. They're filming themselves having sex. They're filming themselves having drugs. It's as if this gets them into trouble. This doesn't make them look good. It's as if it hasn't happened until it's been filmed. There's something very odd going on, which I don't think Erving Goffman is much of a help with. I do think my reality show experience is, something I always wanted to come back to, when we asked people to be in documentaries and reality shows, why did they say yes? They knew that we would make them look bad. They knew it could well be disasters. They said yes because it gave their life meaning. It said yes because we were a way to fixate their lives, say they're important, and give them a bit of immortality. We were the kind of the connection to some sort of idea of I'm going to say the divine, but something like that. That's what we were playing into. That's why television, that's why Janet Malcolm quite truly says all journalists are murderers. But including Janet Malcolm, actually in particular Janet Malcolm. But so there's something very strange going on, which is really worrying, which is way beyond self-branding, which really scares me. As a parent of teenage children, they are filmed. It's not real until it's been filmed. It's very strange. It's very self-destructive. It's very bad for their image a lot of the time, but they're doing it compulsively.
Can I get into this? I was struck by Gillian's talking about horizontal trust in anthropology. And I think it's helpful and a way to introduce the concept of the unconscious. It's helpful to distinguish trust and identification. in terms of understanding what motivates these, what characterizes and motivates these groups. So Freud's theory of groups is based on identification. And I think what's important about identification, it's not tribalism, as one so often hears, likes, and so forth. That is not the idea, that is not the Freudian idea of identification. The Freudian idea is that there's an unconscious wish. And that has a lot to do with understanding what is so common in a lot of the political groups, which is the backward and forward movement, like, you know, take back, what is it? What was the Brexit thing? Take back control, not take control, take back control, or make America great again. That's a mark, really, of the unconscious. If you look at something like the Trump movement, it's very clear that there's an unconscious identification among these people. What it is very, very difficult to discern. Trust, it seems to me, is something else. That's really where there's a conscious purpose. Of course, conscious and unconscious are always mixed together, but in trust, there's testing and there's experience and there's rationality that goes on when you have groups that work together and test one another and you form trust over time. Identification is immediate. So this may help clarify some of the motives and some of the characteristics of the different groups.
Okay, thank you, Eli. So Gillian, do you want to come in and say one last thing?
Yeah, I've got 2 quick points to make. Firstly, I thought the point that Eli made was great. I would add, though, also that if you look at what united a lot of the slogans that have worked politically, you know, aside from the fact they're often around single issues or single brands, you know, even people like Macron, who come from a centrist perspective, did so by assembling his own pick and mix political party. But many of the slogans were marked by having a sense of empowerment, you know, take back control. Right. Make America great again. There are all these kind of, you know, empowerment slogans, which are dynamic and forward. If you look at the losing ones, Stronger Together, you know, I'm with her, the Clinton one, they're very different. Second point is something that anthropologists often stress, which is the need to look at social silence, what we don't talk about. Don't just look at the noise, the silence too. And a lot of the silence around teenagers is captured in a brilliant book by a woman called Dana Boyd, who is part of a network of digital anthropologists that's been emerging in America in particular in recent years, around groups like the Data and Society Institute in New York. Brilliant group if you don't know their work. And Dana makes this very simple point in a book called It's Complicated, that you can't understand teenagers and cell phones just by looking at the noise of cyberspace and cell phones and tech, which is the issue that parents like me, I'm a stressed out mother of teenagers too, who's constantly, like Peter, worrying about this issue of what cell phones are doing to these kids. But you can't just look at it in terms of cyberspace. You have to look at the silence, which is what's happening in the real tangible world too. And Dana argues that we need to recognize that the physical constraints on teenager movement in the physical world have become very intense in the last century. A century ago, teenagers roamed physically. They got on their bikes, they walked, they met, they congregated. They were physically out of parents' eyes for many, many hours at a time. And they had endless opportunity to experiment, roam, collide with the unexpected in the physical world. Today, particularly in suburban America, but also in the UK to a degree, fear of so-called stranger danger, overscheduling means that teenagers don't physically move with as much freedom anymore. So for some of them, going online into cyberspace is the only place they have to be free to roam, collide with the unexpected without parental eyes. And so you have to look at both sides of the coin. And I think it's a very important, point. Ever since I've read Dana's brilliant book, I've been dedicated to trying to give my own teenagers a lot more physical freedom. Not convinced it necessarily always solves the problem, but I do think taking a holistic perspective is really important.
Thank
Okay,
And
thank you,
thank you.
Gillian.
I've got to jump now. I'm sorry, guys. Apologies. And I want to watch the recording later on.
Yeah, that's right. Do.
Thank you.
Okay, there's another question that's come in,
Bye-bye.
which hasn't been answered. It's been flagged up. So this is, I think, Peter, this one is for you. How do you think electoral populism relates to online equivalents of mob rule types of persecution, both by the right and the left?
It's very interesting, isn't it? So maybe Eli can actually talk to this more, because I assume we are here slightly into his zone of the unconscious and identification. So that's something that's something that seems to be part and parcel of it. You know, there's both the kind of bottom down, I suppose, you know, identification that happens between the leader and the crowd, but then you always have these kind of like communities that are gathering, and it'd be very interesting to think about what, you know, around the leader, and then acts almost, you know, in a lot of these cases, not as instructed sort of mobs, but mobs that go out and kind of attack opponents out of their own volition, you know, self-organize and attack in the name of the leader. And maybe Eli can help about, you know, what is it in that relationship that makes the idea of conscience and responsibility disappear? That famous, the Goering phrase, the Führer is my conscience, you know. It's like you give up your conscience in that kind of relationship, and maybe that's part of its pleasure. So I think that those issues might be interesting to look at. I think from where I'm coming from, it's again one of these reversals that we're seeing. Because when these kind of cyber militias or online troll armies are unleashed, whether self-motivated or instructed or just hinted at by leaders, the people who are on the receiving end always say, look, this is a form of attack. And the cynical, but really legally and in some ways philosophically accurate response is, no, it's freedom of expression. You know, unless you're actually getting into death threats, which are type, you know, could be types of illegal speech, usually calling somebody fake news or a traitor or whatever, or disloyal, which a lot of what these kind of cyber militias do. It's not illegal. And we would be in a really weird place if that was illegal. And so again, we're in the space where the common ways we've thought about dealing with these issues doesn't really hold. Because there is nothing in the sort of, you know, in the First Amendment. I mean, there's nothing in the, there's certainly nothing in the First Amendment, but also nothing in the sort of the articles in the Declaration of Human Rights about disinformation or troll armies, you know. This is a part of legitimate speech. So we have this new sort of phenomenon of a sort of a censorship through noise, which is very, very hard to respond to and to deal with as we think about kind of interventions. So, you know, it's become very, very much sort of associated with these forms of, with the attacks, and I suppose also with their language. You know, the leaders don't need to instruct people specifically, but they designate victims, they define them, they use certain language around them, they legitimize this amoral sort of legal vacuum where these kind of attacks become more normalized. So that there's definitely a lot of things coming together there.
Thank you, Peter. Eli, did you want to have and make any other additions there? There's a very interesting comment in the Q&A that's come in from Chloe Saunders, who's a training psychiatrist. He's really just describing a situation of being, you know, in practice in an emergency department or an ER department with a 12-year-old who during the assessment was filming themselves and filming the assessment, and she's just describing the relationship between the assessment and this process of filming, and how when not filming she became more distressed. So these are the sort of infectious property of social media that's extending to teenage and youth. Yes, I think that's quite a common experience in child and adolescent psychiatry now.
Chloe, if you'd like to reach out to me, I'd love to talk to you, partly about my children, but partly also because I'm writing about this. That's very serious. So if you can, I don't know if you can connect us.
Yeah.
I love that very much, actually, for all those reasons.
Well, we're coming now close to break time. So perhaps now is the time, Eli, unless you've got any final comments, or Peter, before we break.
I had a question for Eli. Maybe he can come back to it later, but it's connected to this, so I thought I'd ask it now. So we talk about, I very much like your idea about the unconscious and all these Freudian ideas about the weird unification with the leader and identification. I was wondering, have you thought about René Girard in this sense as well? Because Girard, of course, has a slight tweak on the Freudian idea that, we're essentially imitating creatures and we're imitating each other all the time. Which I think is deeply connected to identification, but especially with social media. Is Girard an interesting way in for us to think about social media and the kind of the patterns there? So is it identification and imitation as well? And what is that mimetic moment in this relationship? You're muted.
Eli, you've got to unmute. Press the unmute button.
I haven't really studied Girard. Plato, mimesis is really, the text for imitation. And Plato's, approach to mimesis is really very close to Freud's, because it's irrational and it's not based on similarity. Something else goes on that makes, and this is Plato's critique of democracy, is that the mimetic or contagious, hysterical, contagious, imitative processes destroy the capacity for collective reasoning and rationality.
Interesting.
But imitation in Freud's day, Tarde and so forth, imitation was the main theory of crowds and crowd behavior before Freud. And Freud is giving identification as an alternative to imitation. He's rejecting the idea of imitation for the idea of identification. Also, the identification is not with the leader. The identification is with the crowd. What you talked about before in Freud's, I'm just saying Freud's theory. In Freud's theory, you substitute the leader's ego ideal, which I'm going to talk about, for your own. And because everyone makes the same substitution, that is, everyone establishes the same relationship to the leader, which is to take the leader's ideal and make it their own, then they identify with one another because they've done the same thing. So the ego ideal, the ideal version, like Trump is all of his followers' ideal version of who they want to be. He's like them, but a little looser, a little bit more libido, a little freer in his libido is how Freud puts it, and Adorno puts it, and so forth. So they're not really identifying with Trump, but rather they're enhanced by the fact that they feel like they're swollen up, inspired really by how he is, and because everyone is doing the same thing, they identify.
Okay.
That's Freud's theory.
Well, fascinating to hear more from you.
That's a little different from imitation.
And you're going to speak more later about some of that. Well, I think this is a good time for us to take a break. We're running pretty much on schedule. Fascinating start, all this perspective from the media. And so we're going to rejoin with perspectives from psychiatry, Dr. Quinton Deeley, but we'll have a break now until the hour. So back on the hour, please. So 3 o'clock UK time, or if you're in the East Coast,
10 o'clock.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Eli. See you then.